least. So hi, I'm Karina McGlynn. I'm the managing editor for Gulf Coast. Thank you guys so much for coming out tonight to the Gulf Coast reading series. Just a couple of announcements before we bring up our host for the evening, Kim Bruss. First of all, I want to say does everybody see back there at the table? I can't see, but you guys can probably see. See the table with the big sexy lady poster on it? You see the guy sitting at the table? Anthony, can you wave? Is he waving? Okay, yeah, I see something moving. That's Anthony. He is one of our super senior interns, and he's been just invaluable to Gulf Coast, and especially the Gulf Coast reading series. And this is his last reading series as our intern. Aww. So everybody, go up and shake his hand and buy a copy of Gulf Coast from him. We've got a sale going on right now. The new issue is $10, but all back issues are only $5. So it would make him really happy if you went and bought something from him, or at least said hello. But thank you so much for all you've done for Gulf Coast, Anthony. We're going to miss you. Let's see, what else? Oh, rumor has it that there's some people up in here from Lake Charles tonight. Is that true?
Yes.
Is that true? One guy? Just one guy? Two of you? One guy's going, I'm not from Lake Charles. Okay, well, any case, we're really happy that people drove a long way to come see our fabulous readers tonight. So welcome. Stick around afterwards. Also, next month, there will be no reading series here in December. Instead, what we do annually is we have something called the Gulf Coast versus Poison Pen reading. If you've never been to Poison Pen, it happens at Poison Girl once a month, and usually it's a local person, somebody from our program sometimes, and then like a bigger name from out of town. But usually at the end of November, December, Gulf Coast editors take over Poison Pen, and you'll see this quick fire reading where all of the Gulf Coast senior editors come up and just do their thing and take over Poison Pen. It's a lot of fun. We're doing something really special this year called the Haiku d'Etat as an added bonus. And basically what that's going to be is a couple of brave editors from the Gulf Coast staff, including myself, and then the Poison Pen crew. I don't know who yet, maybe Greg Oakes, Matt Johnson, a head-to-head haiku face-off that's judged by the audience. So it should be a lot of fun. I hope you guys can make it out to that. It's going to be on November 29th. So mark your calendars. Finally, please join me in turning your cell phones to silent or all the way off if you haven't already. And now I want you to give a big round of applause to our host for this evening, the lovely Miss Kimberly Bruss.
Oh, Karina's so much taller than I am. All right, thank you so much, Karina and Zach. I think they deserve a round of applause for all the work they've done so far this year. Thank you for hiring me when no one else would. First up tonight is Whitney Maurer, who is one of my close personal friends here in the program. The first time I heard Whitney read was almost exactly 3 years ago, and her words flowed through me like lightning. The first time I heard her sing, I felt the same way. The beauty of both Whitney's prose and her music is almost sinister. It's sneaky and stealthy. It caresses until it hurts. Her stories are soft and sad and funny and dangerous. While Whitney's Mormon upbringing is a marked source of inspiration for her, her stories are simultaneously intimate and universal. In fact, reading her work, I felt I was a part of her process for a moment. I was sure it was me who wrote that I am the island and my older sister is the mainland, that she will always be the body I orbit, that she is the night and I am but a ship passing through. Or that the monster crouching in the closet is actually George Washington, gnashing his wooden teeth and fluffing his powdered wig. We find Whitney's protagonist constantly bruised and battered, constantly afraid or worried, constantly making a mess, ingesting cleaning products, falling out of trees, letting their skin scab in the sun. But these dangers that befall Whitney's characters are necessary and instructive. They are growing pains. Whitney Maurer grew up a Mormon in Provo, Utah. Thanks to books, rock and roll, and some phenomenal college professors, she left the church to try and become a writer. Last spring, she was awarded the Robert J. Sussman Prize for Fiction through Imprint. Whitney is also a singer and musician, and a few years ago released an album, Out of Austin, which can be found on iTunes. She plays her songs around Houston often and is a close friend of mine, Whitney Maurer.
Woohoo! Thank you, Kim. That was so sweet. All right. It's nice to see you guys. I haven't been out here in a while. The piece I'm reading from, excerpts I'm reading from, is called Deseret. At the end of summer there was a storm, and when the water filled up the rivers overflowed, forcing the crickets onto the land in long dark braids. In absurd flourishes they came and bred, as if the water had borne them. They filled every space there was to fill. The flood was serious enough to bring the insects, but not serious enough to spill into every house, or carry livestock away, or cause buildings to cower. Still, it made many things difficult. The roads could not be used to drive or walk upon because the creatures would hit your windshield or eyes like black hail. Then the black hail would fall to the ground without melting and crawl across the road, causing motorists to swerve from fright, or bodies to succumb completely. Some of the people's feet got wet. Some of the food the people had stored for the rapture, too, got wet. 3 months' worth of potatoes, powdered milk, dried apples, all spoiled in the storm. It seemed you could hear the fury of their crisp little bodies rubbing against the world. You could hear them breathing, it seemed. Nobody slept. For weeks the people waited for the gulls to come relieve them of the pests, as they had in stories of old, and yet they did not come. For weeks the people ate what remains of their stored food hadn't been spoiled by the flood and the insects. They stared silently as they chewed, every so often looking to the window to see if this was the end, if Christ was descending from on high, a cloud so gauzy yet strong enough to hold his great weight. Like magic he would come to relieve them and to reign, no, like divinity. For weeks people could not attend church and thus broke bread at home to make sacrament, or crackers if they didn't have bread, or even sweets if they didn't have crackers. And as disrespectful as they felt altering a tradition, some of the children and even some of the adults secretly liked that Jesus' body was different this once, a saltier or sweeter flavor than usual, garlic, butterscotch, wheat, or cherry. For some, this small moment in the midst of the storm made the burning in them for him even more tangible, while for others it revived a forgotten lust for certain things, things one ought not to consume in excess. As for his blood, the good people of Price used nothing special or different. They drank the same thing they drank in the chapel. They drank water, only this time not in small plastic cups presented in silver trays, carried by young men in white shirts, but in regular-sized drinking glasses or mugs or even bowls, as they sat at their large kitchen tables with their families in reverence. They drank water, because for the Mormons, the blood of Christ is clear. From her desk, the woman who keeps the inn of the town, the Price is Right Inn, watches the door of her one occupied room, the first room she has filled in 19 days. God has decided to teach his chosen people a lesson by way of storm, and when the flood came, the woman took this lesson into her heart. She watched her pain and discomfort merge with the warmth of the Holy Ghost, as a cloud might merge with another, and she was calmed. As the sun sets behind the mountain at the far end of the valley, the woman dries her hands on one of her many colorful hand towels she crocheted for the rooms of the motel. She had inherited the Price is Right Inn from her father years ago, and she keeps it well. She walks to the window, open the blinds just slightly so that she will know when the lights of her one occupied room are turned off. She walks back to the desk to the magazine she has been studying, where inside there is a pattern that shows how to crochet a tiny dress for a tall bottle of kitchen sink soap. The woman does not sit. She tears out each page as she reads. The pages dot the floor at her feet, where each time they fall, her cat hisses. Later that night, the cat swallows one of the crumpled pages whole and is fine. When the storm first subsided, deceiving people into the streets with what seemed to be a clear sky, a farmer attempted to resume his work, and was said to have died when suddenly overcome by an inexplicable black specter and thrown from his vehicle to the water. This was one of the storm's 4 casualties. And as the farmer drowned, the tractor carried on despite him into the thick, unforgiving air, until its tank emptied, gasoline trailing out in bubbles across the grass and dirt.
There the tractor stopped in a field just beyond town, and over time the industrious little creatures made it their home. Today, corn stalks have grown around the machine, and from the road you might mistake the mass for a strange house. A teepee, perhaps, grown out of the earth, or some wretched outlaw's sinful hideaway. Like watchmen, birds now nest atop it, like butlers. Passing by, suppose they invite you in for tea. And suppose you accept, trudging through the high grass towards the colony of insects and their hardy black bodies, hundreds of tiny bulbs filled with dark instead of light. On a Sabbath day, you will always hear music coming from one of Price's many chapels. Perhaps a hymn written by one of the pioneers who walked here on foot. And if you ever decide to enter the chapel, you may see an old man sitting in a pew with his daughter's children. They play with toys as one of the priesthood members at the front of the room says a prayer into a microphone. The carpet is a pale brown, just cleaned the day before, and so the chapel smells of industrial-strength shampoo. You see a row of young men in white shirts holding silver trays filled with torn-up pieces of white bread. You see people putting the bread into their mouths. When one young man approaches the old man takes one piece, then pauses, then he takes another and another. And when the young man is dumbfounded by this and his eyes are wide, because surely one should not, like other things, consume Christ's body in excess, the old man pats his arm, for the children, he says. And when the young man rejoins his peers and they walk single file to the front of the chapel to exchange their bread trays for silver trays with water on them, you may see the old man bend over as if to kiss one of his daughter's children, but instead he thrusts the entire gob of bread into his mouth. He closes his eyes. He does not chew. The organ begins to play. They walked here almost 100 years ago. The people who were very brave, American, God-fearing people who followed the man with the voice like a horn, and skin white as the pages of a new Bible, and later white as his own new book. He had extracted the scripture from golden tablets found in the bosom of a faraway green hill, miles and miles from his parents' farm, and translated it with holy stones. He felt and understood things no one on this earth had felt since Jesus had walked among men. And then the people read it and believed, and when the law said they must go because the law was scared of the one truth, they confronted the terrain with broken hearts and contrite spirits, and they sang and they walked west. But sometimes on their journey they forgot about his white skin, because theirs would turn in the cold like a bad piece of fruit, like the cornmeal biscuits in their frozen hands, dirtied by loose prairie sand in the wind. In the morning, when it was time to change shifts, Sister Benson got into a little maroon truck and drove up the freeway and over a hill into the neighborhood. Even after many years of tending the hotel, she still felt odd and somehow delinquent coming home from work when everyone was just starting their days. But the late night hours had suited her as a young woman as they suited her now. And she never missed her Sunday school meetings, despite driving straight from work to church some mornings. She drove her truck with a small blanket over the vinyl driver's seat, which without it, heated up in the relentless desert heat and burned her legs even through her dress. Sister Benson lived in a neighborhood east of the lake with her oldest and only son, Joseph, who for a living transported cargo in large trucks across the country. Most of his time was spent on the road. Their house was one of a cluster of inexpensive ramblers hastily built within the last year. The walls were thin and the trees in the yard were still small, but the tulips she kept grew nicely, that is, when God wasn't teaching her people lessons by way of storm. Sister Benson parked in the driveway and studied the flowers a minute, beaten down by the flood and by the bugs. The 10 or so bushes lining the yard to the door looked diseased, or like a giant creature with a giant mouth had put its head down to nibble. It was sad. She looked around at others' yards where bushes and flower beds and trees were in similar states, but seeing as that much of their landscaping hadn't been especially well conceived to begin with, their yards didn't look as destroyed. The beauty Sister Benson's yard had sacrificed was tragic. For a brief moment, she had a mind to retrieve her gloves and clippers from the back of the truck and just cut them all down, every one, starve the insects of their food a while, maybe take away just a little of God's pleasure. The story goes that when the pioneers settled the desert land, it was difficult to cultivate, the ground being dry and barren. After some time in faith, however, the Mormons were able to make things grow, but a flood came, and with it many crickets. After praying and fasting, after 3 of Brigham Young's 16 wives were taken by hunger, The seagulls, swooping down like God's white fingers, lifted the devils from the crops, plucking them each and every with their precise bills and spitting them into the water. The crops were saved. And after such an event, not one of the believers asked any questions. Nobody even asked where the seagulls came from so far from the sea. If you walk to the park in the city of Price, you may see a man squatting behind a bush like a rodent. You may see him sporting expensive scientific lenses that make the woman he is watching in a window seem near to him, and all the softness he can barely imagine closer. Upon first glance, it may seem his face is covered in a thick mud-like blood. It exits his mouth in pulses. You are horrified, but come closer and look at his gnarled hands. You might find a small bag, and you might realize that what looks like blood is simply masticated licorice, flavored red. And if you look at the label, you may discover that the licorice was purchased from one of the city's many general stores. This one in particular being on the corner between the library and the gymnasium. They call all such places in the city of Price general stores, places where people buy gasoline for their automobiles and colorful chewy candies for afternoon activities. They are called general stores because it keeps the city honest, say the brethren of the priesthood. It reminds the people of Price, say the brethren of simpler times. Outside, the good people of Price, whose cars have dried and are functioning, now attempt to drive to work. By now, the crickets' flattened bodies have blackened most of the roads, spread over the pavement like a fine opal sheen. The town wears it like a great necklace. In the plain, bright city of Price, the trees are new and short. Churches line the streets like rows of soldiers. Sister Benson, the woman who keeps the inn at the edge of town, walks into her house and puts some butter on an old hardened biscuit. She turns on the television and sits down. Without even looking at the screen, she falls asleep. Slowly, a cricket, not too large, makes its way up the back of her chair and perches itself inside one of the knots of her long graying braid. The hair muffles the sound of the insects calling, but at times the sound of the woman's hoarse breath masks the faint chirping completely. Thank you so much, you guys.
Thank you, Whitney. Up next is Elizabeth Lyons. Elizabeth Lyons is a fierce poet, and by that I mean to say that her poetry is not cute or nice. It is raw, stark, sultry. Reading Beth's poems reminds me of taking my clothes off after running through a storm. The poems stick and cling. They are dirty and they misbehave. But I love running through the rain almost as much as I love reading Beth's work, so I'll do it again tomorrow and the day after. In fact, storms and the destruction they bring take center stage in Beth's work, an obsession the color of a bruise. Now that I think about it, I suppose Houstonians know more about storms than most people. You know the harm they bring, but also the renewal they promise. Beth's poems search for the renewed life, the life after the storm. And sometimes the clouds part and the ocean is full again, and that life seems nearly within reach. Elizabeth Lyons was raised in South Carolina and holds an MFA in creative writing from Purdue University. She is a PhD student in literature and creative writing at the University of Houston, where she is a nonfiction editor for Gulf Coast. She has been the recipient of fellowships from Imprint and the Vermont Studio Center. She lives in Houston, where she teaches at the University of Houston and with writers in the schools. She has worked for Forthcoming in Tin House. Elizabeth Lyons.
Thanks for coming out. Can everyone hear me in the back?
Yes, yeah.
Awesome. That would be super. Short girls unite. Perfect. Thank you. So the first poem is sort of an introduction to this larger sequence that's about sanity and relationships, and it is my only funny poem. Wine bars for the nervous daters. A flight of heavenly reds between us. The Syrah blend is berries and licorice. A few sips in, I'll tell you about the hospital, the Demerol, the bad reaction. Shaking in so many nights of not sleep. Insanity was a torn hem and no thread to mend it. We both skipped the terror rogue. Me, the fruit and smoke is high school. You are origins, and think how sometimes wines are like wars, combining things, splitting them again. Stem in your hand, you keep turning. Isn't this Cabernet so earthy? I thought I was deaf. Even once I knew I could hear, I pretended otherwise. One of the patients, sweet on me, my mother's words, kept stealing books, asking for my address. My best friend's Debbie Gibson. He kept saying he looked like a crazed lumberjack in a world without trees. And I knew to keep up the act. It was all temporary, I swear. Look at me. Don't I seem so polished? We stumble sometimes, leaning into strangers on morning trains, trying to stay upright. Even Sauvignons were a chance crossing between two grapes. We're like that in our accidental pairings, and neurons get confused but correct themselves. It's over now, phantasmal. Just don't run away. I've been so lonely. And the rest of these are part of a sequence sort of between a couple. And the first one is splicing the reels. We are comedians in a silent film. You, the star, like always, falling backwards for a laugh. You hold a bag of rice to your mouth. The grains fall so fast, I know it is the smallest blizzard I will ever see. You swallow like a constrictor, and I don't stop the reel. The spotlight clicks on. I see your body as it soaks up the rice, grains swelling underneath your skin. You are uneven and begin to realize. And since this is a silent movie, you don't hear how I beg, pushing on your body, and the floor is a conveyor belt taking you further from me. I try to find the steel door, dry you in the sun, make a cut behind your knee, let the rice spill out, become an island at our feet. And in this next one, I was driving and I was imagining sort of different scenarios, like what happens if someone came up to you and said, I'm a cat. No, I've got a cat inside my body. No, I'm half bird. And I just thought that was a really interesting idea. Like, if you met someone and they were like, I'm half bird. So that's where this poem comes from. How we become extinct. Birds at risk are red-listed. You can number in the thousands and still be a threatened thing. Somewhere there is a laboratory, and scientists are projecting the year of the swallow's death. There is only one of me, the half-bird man, and the men are confused because I was to die 10 years ago. They have graphs and a timetable, but I keep burning them, the papers they give to my wife saying, dementia precox, recurring delusions, self as bird, self as God, self as father, catatonic and manic episodes. These papers are a code that mean, why is he alive? This species no longer exists. Make the anomaly disappear. Wings are inside my body. It's why I'm so itchy. Truth in X-ray. Sometimes I'm a zoo filled with angry mammals. It's why I mutter and my heart beats fast and I claw at you. My wings are grown together. Stop calling them ribs. Just give me a knife. I will show you when I'm open. If I could just get to my wings, I would have lift to leave here. Please don't sigh and lock the windows. Do you want me to smash against the glass? Let's say a storm is a type of confession. You tell me the clouds are in the house again, and when you wake in the night, tornadoes are on the bedroom wall. It has been a spring without rain. You say you are the reason for this drought. You cut your body. It is the only way to make the rains come back. You say, I have taken in all the storms. You say, I am a dervish. No, I am a tornado. I have taken up this house and broken the china. I am. The tornadoes are heavy with the weight of you. You are spiraling. You are taking me over. You are turning again. You have been jumping into the cold river. It is March. The swallows are still gone. You cannot calm yourself. There is a scale to rate this devastation. 0 bends a tree. A 5 rips buildings from their foundations. There is nothing for us to do but get out anyway. And this is the last one. Thank you so much for coming out. How all things are managed. They call it a falling into death. 2 dogs are shot into my vein. 3-second breath, then the shake and jerk. 1 dog starves and the other feeds on its body. Remember, thou art dust. If I am lucky, there is only the darkness and then an explosion. Perhaps a fracture, a concussion, a dislocation. Flecks of blood. If the illness in your brain is brutal, be brutal back. Thank you.
Thanks, Beth. And up for us last night is Eric Howerton. Eric Howerton's fiction is never ordinary. His characters and scenes are always recognizable, but they are obscured by time or dream or circumstance. There's a noticeable tilt in Eric's work, which, to quote something from one of his stories, aids us in leaving behind everything we know, everything that makes us comfortable, everything that holds us together, everything that holds our shape. In the absence of everything we know, Eric recreates for his character a world where space travel is not only possible, it is common, where people's bodies fall apart and reassemble themselves haphazardly in the night, where dreams are more real than hours spent awake. And in this transitional space, we are left looking for not what is gone, but what is missing. Eric Howerton is a 4th-year PhD in fiction at the University of Houston's Creative Writing Program, as well as a Gulf Coast fiction editor. Since moving to Houston, he has been a restaurant reviewer for Spoon and Barstool Magazine, the frontman for a heavy metal band, the victim of a Hamburglary, and last month he successfully completed 2 of his 3 comprehensive exams. So give him a pat on the back. He is also an avid cook and griller. Eric Howerton.
It is bright up here. Thanks, Kim. That was great. So as Kim mentioned, actually the last time I was on this stage was in a heavy metal band. That was probably back in January. And I know everybody in the house is really here just to sort of see me do that again. So instead of reading a story, I thought I would just do like 30 minutes of a cappella heavy metal for you guys. Right, so just I'm gonna shack. That song was called My Love. No, but one thing I did learn from being a band is that audience participation makes it better for everyone. So I'm going to ask you guys, and you'll know when, I'll cue you. to repeat the title of this story at various points throughout the story. All right? So the title of the story, is that all right with everybody? Can you do that? All right. So the title of this story is We're Number One. And you can dedicate this to anybody you want to, really. All right. So that's what you guys say, too. All right. Before that day, Lauren thought Greg was a good husband, an upstanding citizen, and the perfect Little League father. He hadn't missed a game all season, and he was sure to arrive with a cooler full of sports drinks to combat energy lulls. He worked his jaw steadily through all the chants and sing-songs, and he booed and hissed when needed, admonishing the anonymous umpires. Greg could be a little overzealous at times, but children appreciate grand gestures. Sometimes they're the only gestures children understand at all. So Lauren didn't think twice when Greg climbed up to the bleachers on the way back from the concession stand with an oversized foam hands with the word "We're Number One" printed in white ink on purple. It was a bargain, Greg said, thrusting the mitt in the air. Only $5. Lauren bit into the hot dog Greg had handed her. "We're number one," he said comically. That's where you guys should come in on something. "We're number one," he said comically. "Right," Lauren replied, laughing. The crack of a bat grabbed Greg's attention, and he leapt to his feet and he cheered the first single of the day, as though it were a home run. "Woohoo!" he screamed. "We're number one." He did a little jig, shaking his hips and jabbing the finger in the sky. Their son was batting next. The dance made Greg look a little clownish. But Lauren didn't say anything because she was having a good time, and so was he. And for now, that's all that mattered. Had he been content to waggle the finger with a little more restraint, Lauren wouldn't have minded so much. But Greg's faith in the power of the hand was as loud and steadfast as it was annoying. And after a few more innings, his antics started earning him looks from the opposing team. Not that he seemed to notice. He jabbed his hand toward the heavens each time one of the lights swung the bat. He shot to his feet whenever his sons Timmy or Graham, ages 9 and 10 respectively, shagged a fly ball. No throw, bunt, or pitch went unlauded. He looked for any reason to spear the hand in the air and claim unassailable victory for their son's team, even though the lights were down by 11 runs. 11 was probably the number of times Lauren would have to wash their uniforms. Eventually, she told Greg to tone it down. He replied something about supporting the team no matter what. "No matter what," he repeated severely. When the National Lights pitcher intentionally hit an opposing batter with a fastball, the east side bleacher erupted in a communal boo. In response to their outrage, Greg's voice rang like an out-of-tune trombone. "Take that," he jeered, pointing to the purple hand at the child limping to first base, because we're number one. Good job. No longer wanting the stigma of being the wife of that asshole with the foam hand, Lauren inched away from her husband. And then, after Greg roared a few more times, she scooted down the bleachers even more. She struck up a conversation with Bradley, father of Rosie. Rosie was the only girl on the team. She always played right field, and Lauren couldn't help watch and think that even though Rosie hadn't touched the ball all season, even though she was standing alone in a sea of green, she was still a part of the team. Bradley asked if Lauren was still going to teach history in the new under-construction high school. Lauren said she didn't know. After erecting the new school, which was costing millions of dollars, the district might not have anything left for part-time history teachers. "They're already cutting down the arts," she said. "What's next?" "It'd be a shame if they had to sacrifice anything, part-time or not," Bradley said. Silently, Laura agreed. No one she'd talked to thought tearing down the old school was a good idea. Regardless, the district was moving ahead. The old high school would be demolished, and a new one would be built in its place. When they tore down the vetoed structure, there would be a fantastic explosion. It was almost as though it was the way things had to be. After the shame of defeat, Timmy and Graham's muddied faces were streaked with tears. They'd played hard, Lauren reminded them, but it didn't matter. Someone had to lose. That's the dirty trick of winning. Next season, Lauren said optimistically. Next season. It wasn't until after Greg had driven through several red lights that Lauren noticed the large, spongy article still covering his left hand. She started to say something, but was interrupted before she could.
We're number one!
Greg screamed without warning, tooting his horn at the car in front of him. A rusty import stalled at the intersection. In the back seat, the boys looked up from their pouts. Just go around him, Lauren said when Greg blasted the horn again. He jerked the wheel with his free hand and passed the other driver. The purple finger weaved and bobbed. When Lauren leaned to adjust the AC, the finger brushed against her upper lip. She pushed it away.
We're number one!
Greg yelled again as he ran another stoplight. Honey, she said.
We're number one!
He shouted a third time, passing a Masonic lodge. What's the matter with you? She asked quietly, hoping the boys wouldn't hear her. Greg didn't respond. Why are you still wearing that thing? I don't think it's safe to be driving with it on. In the back street, the boys were absorbed with handheld video games. When they reached the gate to their community, Greg rolled down the window and punched the security code into the box. We're number one, he said. The iron gate yawned. My sentiments exactly, Lauren thought, admiring the luck of the opening gate, its carelessness, its obligation to nothing and no one, not even the heavy burden of itself. Greg plopped himself on the sofa and flipped on the TV. He was still wearing the hand. Lauren shooed the boys away. Hit the shower, she coached. Anything good on TV, she asked Greg when the boys had gone, not expecting much of a response, but acting as though she did. He aimed the remote control at the 54-inch flat-screen TV and fired off shots, making pew-pew noises of cowboys and Indians. After a few more clicks, he settled on ESPN. More games, huh, she said. Gotta get your fix, I guess. Sports all looked the same to Lauren. Hordes of little beasts darting back and forth, huddling and hurtling, rushing through diamonds and circles and squares. And for what? A trophy? Some momentary glory? It was all Greek to her. The players choreographed to carry out schemes that defied comprehension, or at least defied her desire to comprehend them. She wondered if the participants in the game even knew what they were fighting for, or if they were just following orders. She tried to learn, but for what it was worth, an outfielder was a pitcher, was a catcher. A linebacker was a goalie, was a shooter. During the game, she tried several times to snatch the foam hand, but Greg was quicker and seemed to know just when she was going to lunge. This thing is pretty evasive, too. He had only to flick his wrist in the opposite direction, and the tip of the finger swooshed smoothly out of reach. After a number of defeats, Lauren gave up trying to snag the hand and went to the kitchen to make the boys a snack. Timmy and Graham returned with wet hair and a faint trace of grubbiness that wouldn't go away. Sandwiches, Graham groaned as she was cutting the crusts. You can make something else, she said more harshly than she intended, sliding the plates across the breakfast bar. When Greg belted his incantation again, Timmy looked at his father, then to Lauren. Is something wrong with Dad? He whispered. No, she said, sounding upbeat. Nothing at all. The boys looked at each other. He's turned into a basket face, hasn't he? Greg asked, mouthful of sandwich. It's basket case, Lauren said. And no, he hasn't. He's just playing a game with himself. It doesn't sound like a game, Timmy snorted. It is, though, she said, putting things back in the fridge. It's just like baseball, but with different rules. Will he win? Graham asked. We'll have to wait and see, she said. Later that afternoon, she called her mother. But instead of talking to a person, she got the machine. It bothered her when her parents didn't answer. They never went anywhere, and there was no reason for them not to pick up, except that they'd developed an irrational fear of everything outside their own home. They didn't travel, and whenever Lauren suggested they go on a trip, her mother dismissed the idea as though she'd suggested they change religions. Traveling is too dangerous, she'd say. It's not healthy to keep yourself cooped up all the time, Lauren would argue. Nobody's cooped, her mother said. And besides, your father saw the world during the war. I can show you the postcards. It's not the same when you're a soldier, Lauren said, remembering that her father had once told her his days as a soldier in World War II were the best he'd ever had. Hanging up without leaving a message, Lauren decided now was a good time as any to replant the bulbs in the neighborhood, to replant the bulbs the neighborhood kids had yanked from her garden. Changing clothes, she heard Greg turn off the TV and make his way to the backyard. The familiar rattling sounds of setting up the grill soon followed. Through the thin walls of their suburban home, she could hear Greg muttering, "We're number one," to himself in a low, breathy mantra. In the garden, she occasionally heard Greg, and she feared the neighbors would too. When a louder, "We're number one," erupted from the backyard, she grimaced. A moment later, Lee, who lived next door, leaned over the hedge and asked if everything was all right. Lauren told Lee to mind his own business. She wasn't often rude to the neighbors, and she genuinely liked Lee. At a block party a few years back, she'd briefly flirted with the idea of having an affair with him, just to see what it would be like. Ultimately, though, she'd decided against it. An affair seemed too European, too un-American. "Listen," he said, "I don't really know what's going on with Greg, but if he doesn't, reboot soon, I've used someone who might be able to help. I can give you the number of someone reliable." "A shrink?" Lauren scoffed. I know, he said. "There's still a lot of stigma about psychiatry and whatnot, but really, why should there be? We're all nuts. Some of us just don't know how to like it." After finishing in the garden, Lauren watched Greg and the boys through the pulled curtains of the living room window. Undeterred by their losses, Timmy and Graham were playing catch in the backyard, while Greg stood over the grill, flipping sizzling rounds of beef on charcoal, a spatula in one hand, and that damned, wobbly foam abomination in the other. Monkey tails of smoke swept towards his eyes, though Greg didn't seem to notice. Instead of flinching or waving the smoke away, he wore a look of imperturbable concentration when he yelled,
"We're number one."
To no one in particular. Lauren jumped and let go of the curtains. She pulled them back to steal another look and saw Greg's attention return to the grill as though nothing had happened. He pressed the burgers with the flat of the spatula. The boys continued tossing the ball. After setting the table for dinner, she took another look through the window, expecting to find things as before. Instead, Greg was sitting with the boys in the grass. Given how oddly he'd been behaving that day, Lauren expected to see looks of panic or fear on her son's faces, but this wasn't the case. The boys seemed completely enamored by what their father, who was still wearing the hand, had to say. She slid open the door and waited a moment, hoping to hear what Greg was discoursing on, but he was speaking too quietly. She called the boys several times before they looked up. When they did, she told them to come inside and get ready for dinner. Timmy and Graham looked to their father for approval. He barely nodded, dismissing them. They rose lethargically and slothed inside. Greg didn't move except to look at the sky, admiring something. But for her life, Lauren couldn't figure out what he was looking at. The sky was so clear, there couldn't be anything of interest up there. Could there? She didn't know, and as she slid the patio door shut, she told herself she didn't care. She hoped her no hats at the dinner table policy included other game day paraphernalia, but apparently it did not. As she doctored her burger, placing a pickle in the middle of the patty, Greg's cheer arrested her, stopping her fingers as they laid down a tart little mine of vinegar and dill.
We're
Number one. She couldn't take it anymore. The joke had gone on long enough, and she was going to put an end to it right now.
We're number one.
God damn it, Greg.
We're number one.
Stop, won't you? Just stop saying that and take off that fucking hand. But he didn't stop, and he didn't take it off. He leapt to his feet and thrust the hand to the sky like a warrior gracious for his good fortunes.
We're number one.
He howled. The boys, who'd first been entertained and then concerned by their father's behavior, suddenly joined in with ultimate devotion. We're number one, Graham babooed, blasting a torrent of ketchup on top of his cheeseburger.
We're
Number one, Timmy shouted, a knife in one hand and a fork in the other. Boys, she warned. Chanting with their father, the boys looked even dirtier than before. Lauren pleaded with them, but her frustration only made them louder. They smiled at her as the words slipped from their mouths, laughing as though it was all fun and games. We're number one, they cried. We're number one. The foam finger swished about like a misguided rocket. In imitation, the boys pointed their fingers to the ceiling, moving their arms to an imaginary rhythm, pointing up, up, and away.
We're number one.
We're number one. They went out the front door. Lauren followed and watched as they danced on the front lawn. Their movements were jerky and violent. Arms in the air, legs lifted high, teeth gnashing, crescents, broad, unflinching. Stop it, she screamed. She first tried to tackle Timmy, then Graham, but before she could reach them, they were in the street, each on their heels having touched down on the iron grating that covered the pipes under the pipes. The streetlight made the diamond-shaped grating glow an eerie white. Greg and her son skipped down the asphalt, calling out as loudly as they could.
We're number one.
Get back inside, Lauren hissed. Hearing the ruckus, the neighbors started appearing at their windows and doors, and they started opening them. More and more people took notice of the chanting, and as they did, Lauren became increasingly worried that her neighbors would think her entire brood had cracked up, that her running about was part of the boasting and bragging, when really, she wanted nothing more than for the entire thing to end, for everyone to just shut up and go back inside and eat dinner in silence, and to take off that damn hand. Was that too much to ask? But when she looked deep into the eyes of her neighbors, another fear seized her. The fear made her ribs shake. The look on the faces of the men and women standing in their doorways, the Robinsons, the Longs, the Sanchezes, people she thought of as kind and decent. The look they wore was like that of her husband, and when he stood over the grill in confusion. Excuse me. Let me do that again. All right. The look they wore was like that of her husband as he stood over the grill in confusion. And Lauren began to worry that at any minute now, they would edge away from their doorways and join her husband, that they too would play the game. Thank you, everybody.
Give all our readers one more round of applause. Those of you who are parked at the convenience store across the street should leave as soon as I'm done to move your car because they're towing apparently. A big thank you to Gulf Coast and to Rudyards for hosting us tonight. I was especially flattered to read for all the readers tonight, not just because they're all so talented, but because I love them all dearly as people. And just remember to tip your bartenders, they're here for us. So thank you all for coming.